So we're going to have a discussion about a couple of things. Firstly, what do we make of this idea of public impact as a framework for thinking about the future of public services? But more broadly, what are the examples that we can put on the table of success and failure of public services reform in Asia? And what are the challenges in terms of, aging, demanding citizens, changing technology that provide the backdrop to the need to continually reform and update public services both in advanced economies like Singapore, but also around the region. So that's it. I'll leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Danny will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll then have a conversation amongst ourselves, and that will comfortably get us through until 6:30 when we will wrap up bang on time. So thank you very much for coming. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. There's a gap between what governments are achieving and what governments could be achieving. Now, this is true all over the world, but particularly in this region. And if we did nothing else in this world other than just help governments achieve what they're already trying to achieve, so not set them higher targets or more lofty goals, but just help them do the things they're already trying to do today. If we did that, the difference we'd see would be absolutely massive. And this is the premise upon which the Centre for Public Impact was founded, that if we can just help governments be more effective, that would make an absolutely enormous difference. The problem is, before we can do that, we need to know what makes government effective. And of course, there are lots of answers out there. You could go to all kinds of different epistemic communities. You could go to the AI, to the artificial intelligence community, and they would tell you that artificial intelligence is the thing that will transform the way governments achieve outcomes, which, by the way, I think is true. Or you could go to the evidence-informed policymaking community, and they would tell you that one thing that really will make a massive difference is just using better evidence in policymaking. Or you could go to the design thinking people, and they would tell you that human-centered design and more empathy-driven methods are really the way to go. And all these people, of course, have a point, and they're right in some way, but we also felt that all their answers were, while correct, were possibly incomplete, that they all covered a very important piece of the picture, but not the full picture. And if you ask people about specific policies, what made this or that specific policy succeed or fail, then what we usually get is a very convincing narrative of what happened in that particular instance. And I'll give you an example of such a narrative around the smoking ban in the UK. It was enacted in 2007. The white paper was passed in 2006. The ban was enacted in 2007. And it was a massive success. We saw a compliance rate of 99.7%, which is absolutely unheard of for any government measure in the United Kingdom. We saw a massive drop in people admitted to critical care units with cardiac arrests, and immediately in the public health figures we could see the improvement in people's health. So for all intents and purposes, a spectacular success. And indeed, if you were to walk around Whitehall and pick out a random civil servant from the street and ask them to give you an example of a successful policy, odds are that they might give you this one, because it's universally recognized as an extreme success. Well, why is that? If you then were to ask the same random civil servant that you just picked off the street to explain to you why that happened, you'd get some sort of very convincing narrative, and it will probably include things like, well, Wetherspoons, one of the biggest pub operators, had voluntarily already trialled smoke-free pubs 2 years before the ban was passed. So one of the biggest stakeholders who could have been against the measure was already on board. Or they might tell you that it was a cross-partisan measure, so both Labour and Tory party were in favour, so this wasn't a partisan issue, and almost all MPs voted in favour. Or they might tell you that, in fact, pubs are already very tightly regulated establishments in the UK. If you're trying to get a beer after 10 p.m. or so, you'll know what I mean. And so therefore, just layering on another regulation on top of an already quite tight bundle of regulations wasn't such a big. The issue with these kinds of explanations is that they're extremely convincing, but they're stories. They're engaging stories, but they don't leave us with any sort of bigger sense for why something succeeded or failed, and it doesn't allow us to compare different policies or initiatives in any meaningful sort of way. And so what we set out to do was to find a model or a theory, if you will, that was both empirically robust and practically useful. The first thing we did was to look at more than 200 case studies of public policies from around the world, from all continents, minus Antarctica, from all levels of government, regional, local and national, and also from all different kinds of political systems. The second thing we did was to go talk to a large number of highly respected academics, because we wanted to make sure that we'd incorporate the latest academic thinking. And indeed, Kenneth Tan, who of course is here, was one of the people who helped us a lot with this. And then finally, we did an exhaustive scan of the literature to make sure we didn't miss anything. And time again, we kept seeing the same patterns occurring, and we kept seeing the same things being in place when a policy succeeded, and we kept seeing the same things being absent when a policy failed. And I'll take you through what those are, and these three things, we call them the public impact fundamentals. The first one is policy. In all instances, we need a well-designed policy. So if the policy is irredeemably flawed to begin with, things will be difficult. Secondly, we saw that you need an action mechanism, or some people call this implementation, some way of taking this policy into a real-world effect. And then finally, legitimacy, which is to say the popular support and the support of the stakeholders for a given measure. Because we can have the most evidence-based policy on the planet with multiple hundreds of randomized control trials supporting the fact that it works, yet if we either can't implement it because our machinery of government isn't capable of doing it, or if we could implement it but it's simply seen as illegitimate and as the wrong thing to do, it's not going to achieve impact. Now, this is an important point to make. We don't claim that any of this is mind-blowing in any sense of the world. What we've done is take what many people probably have as a solid intuition about what is needed and put that in a neat, coherent model. And I can be more specific about what we mean when we say these words: policy, legitimacy, and action. With legitimacy, we talk of public confidence, stakeholder engagement, and political commitment. So public confidence asks the question whether we believe that the larger public thinks that what we're trying to do is the right thing to do. Stakeholder engagement is self-explanatory, and political commitment asks whether the political leadership is willing to stick something out, whether the political leadership is willing to invest capital to make something work beyond the day a law or a measure is passed, but in the long run. For policy, we think of it as consisting of clear objectives, which is obvious enough, but more often than not, actually not the case. Evidence, which in this context we think of as the best available evidence, rather than some specific kind of evidence, because what best available evidence means varies drastically between different policy areas. And finally, feasibility, which is the question whether something is economically, legally, and fiscally feasible. Because again, we may have a wonderfully evidence-backed policy, yet if it's not fiscally or legally feasible, it's not going to work. And then finally, on action, we think of it as management, measurement, and alignment. So do we have the right processes and people in place to manage this? Can we measure it against those clear objectives? And is everyone who needs to work together to deliver something, or in Michael Barber's word, everyone in this chain of delivery, aligned and trying to achieve the same goal? But this is a simple enough framework, and I'll take you through briefly to the application of this to the smoking example, which today, in retrospect, with 2020 vision, looks like a slam dunk, and like an obvious success. But it need not be that. It needn't be that case. If we look at legitimacy, we see that stakeholder engagement was extremely strong. Wetherspoon's, indeed one of the biggest pub operators, was on board and was not opposed to this measure. Political commitment was strong, and public confidence was also strong. On the eve of the law being passed in 2007, more than 60% of Brits were in favour of this measure. And you can play the counterfactual and imagine what that would have looked like if the smoking ban had been passed not in 2007, but in 1997. And we know the polling data, and we know that popular support for a smoking ban was well below 50% at the time. So it is not obvious that if the UK had tried to pass the exact same law 10 years prior, that it would have worked as smoothly and as successfully. If you look at policy, the objectives were reasonably clear. The evidence was strong, both the evidence that this could work, because it had been done before in Ireland, it had been done before in Australia and in New York, and indeed to some extent here in Singapore. And the feasibility was strong. This was not a complicated thing to do, and there were no legal or physical barriers of any sort. And then finally, on action, this was easy to implement in the UK, precisely because bars and pubs are so tightly regulated. There's no doubt over who is in charge of making sure that bars and pubs stick to regulations. So all the UK needed to do was layer another regulation on top of an existing enforcement mechanism. Now, looking at this picture, what our claim is that if you had done this type of analysis on the eve of the implementation of the measure in 2007, we could have rather confidently predicted that this would be a success. And now, you might think, well, is there a comparable case where this wasn't a success? Because after all, implementing a smoking ban isn't that hard. Well, funnily enough, in the Netherlands, which for all intents and purposes are not drastically different from the UK, they tried to do the exact same thing a year prior, and it was a complete disaster. The compliance rate was not 99.7%, but it started in the low 60s and then slid down to the low 40s over the course of 2 or 3 years, making for an utterly failed policy. And if we run the same kind of analysis, we see that the Netherlands had a massive legitimacy problem because the population did not think that that was a legitimate measure. In that particular case, it was because, unfortunately, it was framed as an employee protection measure rather than as a public health measure. And as it turns out, many Dutch bars and pubs are owner-operated, which means they have no employees. So they shrugged and said, well, if this is an employee protection measure, then there's no reason for anyone to stop smoking because I have no employees. So we've been using this model with governments, international organizations, and universities. There's now a Whitehall department in the UK where we're training all incoming civil servants in this methodology, where this is becoming the standard framework or methodology for people to use. And we've now been using this for a year, and we've learned a couple of interesting things from the application of this. And one is that there is a big difference between absolute performance and balance. So we see in the data, we now have 300 case studies, which are all available online, all analyzed against that grid. We see in the data that balance matters more than absolute performance. If you think of this as a stool with 3 legs, it's better to have 3 medium-sized legs rather than 2 very long ones and 1 very short one. So we see empirically in the data that it's better to do okay on policy, legitimacy, and action, rather than do really well on legitimacy, really well on policy, and absolutely horribly on action. Now, this is rather intuitive, but it is neat to see this validated, to see this intuition validated in the data. The other thing that we're seeing is that these 3 elements, of course, are sometimes in tension and sometimes mutually reinforce each other. We can think of many policies, this may be a controversial example, but the drug policy in the UK, there's a very direct tension between what the evidence says and what the legitimacy element says. And we can sort of dial up the legitimacy and therefore automatically dial down the amount of evidence we're using or the other way around. But of course, there are also sometimes instances where these things reinforce each other. So it's easy to imagine cases where, because of high legitimacy, action becomes much easier because enforcement costs go down. And then finally, we think of this as a complex system. And this is hard to convey visually. What we mean to imply no order in these 3 elements. There is no logical order in which these occur. And we're also conscious that the dynamics between these elements are non-linear, and that some of the results that you might see are emergent properties of this complex system. But having said that, we still think that using this kind of simple framework helps us think through how we might be able to improve public policy and how we might be able to improve government effectiveness in a systematic way.
Superb. That's a great overview. So before I ask sort of for initial reflections from both Aaron and Cheryl, I wanted to ask 2 quick questions. One is, can you tell the audience what your centre is? Sort of, where did it come from? How big is it? I'm sure everyone is very familiar with the Centre for Public Impact, but just in case there is some of you who've never heard of it before, tell them kind of who you are and what you do, and that would be useful. And then I have one more question.
We were established by BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. We're a not-for-profit foundation. We're based in Geneva, London, and DC. That's our latest edition. And what we do is we work with governments around the world in improving their effectiveness. So we work directly with governments, mostly central governments, but also some local and regional governments, who are struggling with exactly these types of issues of how to close that gap between what they would like to achieve and what they're actually achieving. And this is one of the tools that we're using. And we're finding people are picking it up in all kinds of different ways. Some governments are using this as a very structured tool, so they're making their policy officials write submissions in that type of format because they feel that improves quality. And others just use it as a mental heuristic, as a sort of mental checklist as they go through policy proposal and as they think through what they might be able to do to improve their performance. Two other things that we do that are worth mentioning. One, we have a piece of work around legitimacy, government legitimacy, how governments gain it, lose it, or maintain it, something that is top of mind for a lot of civil servants and politicians around the world. And the second piece of work is around the impact of artificial intelligence on the ability of governments to deliver outcomes. A very interesting piece of work, and we believe, and I personally believe, that if we look into the future, artificial intelligence will be the one thing, the one technology that will drastically transform the way governments do basically everything.
I mean, in a sense, you sort of preempted the question about, is this all that radical? Is this not just kind of sensible stuff anyone would come up with anyway? But I wondered, in a sense, it is quite radical if you take preceding conceptions of public services reform, and I'm thinking in particular of the kind of old new public management framework where you try and create a market and have contestability. So I wondered, just in case people aren't familiar with the heritage of this, could you just talk for a minute about how, in a sense, this is moving on from what went before, and then I'll bring in our respondents. So.
Yeah. Possibly the most radical aspect of this, if you will, is that we try to always work back from the outcome that we're trying to achieve, from the impact. So this doesn't presuppose any type of mechanism through which government delivers something, which, by the way, is why we call it action rather than delivery or implementation, because that might imply that government itself is doing the delivering or the implementation, whereas, of course, it may be government or it may be some other entity the government is working with. So in a sense, if you take new public management and other market-based approaches as the last reference point, this is a much more outcomes-focused way of thinking about the world.
I had three kind of clusters of thoughts around what Danny presented. Let me just go through those, and I guess they'll become more apparent about why I'm having these thoughts. They're very Singapore-based in the sense of I'm thinking a lot about Singapore examples and how they either illustrate or don't necessarily adhere to the ideas that are in there. And I should caveat by saying I like very much what I heard, but I'm going to start with the thing I think you maybe haven't quite touched on in the framework. And this begins with the story of the fact that I work a lot in Formula One as one of the policy projects that my team looks after, because we look after tourism as well as broader investment promotion. And something like Formula One is interesting for us because we run it not just as government, but in partnership with a local race promoter as well as the Formula One management. And I bring this up because actually that is one of the most important things that gives that project its effectiveness and reasonable amounts of legitimacy in terms of the returns that we get. But we couldn't do that on our own. And the thing I was struck by in the model is that it does tend to assume that government is a reasonably unitary actor. You mentioned stakeholders, but they are engaged rather than involved in or participating as active agents in the policy process. And I actually think that in some instances, it's really important to have people do more than just be engaged. We need stakeholders to be active participants and agents in the process because given the complexity of the sorts of issues that many governments face, they cannot act alone. And if they try to act alone, pretending that they are hermetically sealed off from the rest of a public policy system, you actually end up with quite suboptimal outcomes. So that's the bit I thought we could maybe think a little bit more about. The bits I liked were the second cluster of issues, particularly on objectives, and I think I agree very much there about the importance of clear objectives and the fact that these objectives, I guess, also need to evolve over time. Right? It's how I would kind of add to what's in the model. In fact, your bit on objectives made me think a little bit about the principle that the Nobel Prize economist Jan Tinbergen puts forward, which is to say that we need to have, for as many objectives as we might have, government also needs to have as many policy tools in place. So I think this affects your policy section of the diagram. You don't just need clear objectives, you also need as many tools as the number of objectives that you have. So a really classic Singapore example is the fact that we use exchange rate policy as an anti-inflationary tool. Right? We do that because we are a small open economy, and the only way we can stop imported inflation, which is the most of the inflation that we get, is by having exchange rates maintained at a certain level. Because of that, we cannot use exchange rate policy for other things, like trade competitiveness, for instance. And I think that's an interesting example of how, even with clear objectives, you also then need enough policy variables that you can play with in order to achieve those objectives. The last cluster of issues that I wanted to talk about is really around the idea that we need to test our objectives and have strong evidence and information for what we do, and also have performance metrics that can be measured. Now, I think this sounds wonderful in theory, and I'm just wondering what your experience was like, Danny, when you actually tried to push this into practice and looked at the actual case studies. Because the thing that strikes me is that sometimes, especially if a government wants to be quite adventurous, then there isn't evidence readily available for what it wants to do because nobody's done it before. And so how do we deal then with truly groundbreaking policy issues? One Singapore example actually is the fact that we started thinking last year about using lower fares in the MRT to nudge behavior away from people taking trains during peak hours. And we therefore started an experiment with not just lower fares, but actually free rides, as long as people clocked out of the MRT in any central business district station before 7:45 a.m. Now, why you would want to do that, I don't really know, but well, there you go, my own biases have been revealed, right? But the fact is, we didn't know ex ante whether that was going to work or not. We actually had to try the stuff before we could determine whether it was going to work. And this links a bit to your bit about complex and dynamic systems, I think, because in those sorts of systems, we actually have to try things first, maybe in reasonably contained prototypes, and then stress test the policy assumptions that we're putting into gear. So, again, I don't think this undermines the model. I think this illustrates a little bit some of the difficulty in having clear objectives, clear evidence, even before we test for feasibility. And what it suggests to us is that sometimes we may need to do small-scale, beta-level prototypes and experiments before information is fully revealed, and we can then decide how to scale or not to scale a particular project.
So when Danny was talking, I was thinking about one specific kind of policy area that I might try to apply this model to. I specialize in futures work, so what that means is I look at policy that doesn't exist yet, which is kind of problematic. And that's one of my struggles here at the school, because we spend a lot of time doing case studies and kind of evaluating past policy, but actually if you go out to the real world, you're dealing with challenges that are current and forthcoming. So the big question in my head about the model is really the extent to which it's not just a descriptive tool, but also a prescriptive tool. So I kind of did a little exercise where I tried to look at a futures policy area that I'm quite familiar with, which is autonomous vehicles, and see whether it kind of holds water. So forgive the stream of consciousness evaluation, which is done haphazardly on a piece of paper. But if I think about an issue like autonomous vehicles, so when I was doing the portfolio at the Ministry of Transport, that was quite soon after the 2011 elections. And as you know, at the 2011 elections, the transportation was a very big kind of voting issue. People were very unhappy about the trains, people were very unhappy about public transport in general, traffic, and so on. So when I think about legitimacy, and Danny described it as public confidence, engagement, and the political commitment, I do think that one of the big challenges, and it's kind of a tension for civil servants to manage also, but it's kind of like, how do you put an emerging policy issue onto the agenda when your politicians are fighting, frankly, and your other policy colleagues are frankly fighting very real, tangible, kind of day-to-day issues like train breakdown and so on. And I think that becomes a real question. So it could go one of two ways, right? So one way it could go is a response. So me as, let's say, a futures officer, I come with my wonderful autonomous vehicle portfolio, and I tell my minister, hey, this is something you should look at. And the person says, I have so many things to do, please go away. And then I'm like, hang my head in shame and scribble back to my desk, right? So
Is this a real?
I'm neither going to confirm nor deny anything. So that's one possible response, right? And it could be any futures portfolio. The second possible response could be you go into that same conversation, and they're like, well, we're so desperate now that we'll try anything, because it's such a dynamic environment, and all the existing policy solutions are not working. So maybe we have appetite, therefore for some of these slightly more radical or unusual policy solutions. So I do wonder, about what that civil servant role in getting this kind of political commitment and getting the issue onto the policy agenda in the first place. Because if you can't get on, there's no point in talking about the rest of the cycle, right? So I think that for me is one key issue. I think the second one is this idea of well-designed policy, and how do you think about well-designed policy when you're thinking about an emerging issue? For me, and if I reflect back on the autonomous vehicle issue, one of the more famous or more well-known models was the Google car, right? So everybody saw the cute YouTube with the little car, and that was a very specific what we call use case of the technology. But if we had brought that, which was basically likely owner-occupied single passenger type vehicle. So it wasn't a bus, it wasn't logistics. There were many other possible use cases for the technology. So I think, and when you're thinking about an issue like that, and then thinking about what is a well-designed autonomous vehicle policy, in the context of a country, then it's like, how do you fit that objective with existing objectives? So in the Singapore case, what happened soon after the 2011 elections was that the Transport Ministry, as well as the LTA, the Transport Authority, had put out basically what was a master plan, right? So they did this in 2013, and in the master plan, a lot of their goals were very focused to shifting what we call public sector mode share, so increasing, kind of transportation on public sector, so trains and so on, trains, buses, and so on. So what that tells you, if you're looking at a new policy area, is that if you don't have a shared or public transport mode, it's likely that your autonomous vehicle portfolio policy will fail. So, for example, if you take in the Google car as a private vehicle and slap a COE on it, it actually is not. It doesn't. There's no policy coherence. I don't know whether that's the right word, but there's no policy coherence with the rest of the model. And I think the question about evidence in a futures case, to me, is very interesting. So one way that manifests is that a lot of the evidence, the technical evidence, suggests that autonomous vehicles are much safer than human-driven vehicles, because of basically you eliminate to a large extent the human error. But the perception of safety is worse. So then you have this weird dilemma between what is the public engagement legitimacy aspect and actually what the evidence says, right? So, I can put autonomous vehicles on the road, but everybody's very scared of them, because it's new and they think that they're going to run them over or whatever it is. So you see these quite interesting tensions start to kind of build up within the model, which I think is what Danny was kind of alluding to. Not everything is kind of a virtuous cycle, right? Some of it's actually kind of more dynamic than that. And then the last part, in terms of action, I think for me, when I think about action, and particularly when you look at futures type areas where criticism is a little bit fluffy, or a little bit too abstract, right? So it's got, you can talk about trends, but then, when you actually have to put it into an institution and put a budget to it and put headcount to it, that's a totally different kind of conversation. And I do wonder, and I think this I guess carries on Aaron's last point, what is the role for experimentation in a model like that? because again, it's about, so well-designed policy is sometimes also designed to be a bit clunky, a little bit kind of tentative. So well-designed policy isn't always beautifully designed on the offset, right? Sometimes it's designed to explore multiple options. And you see that particularly in technology, because sometimes well-designed policy upfront leads to very quick technological obsolescence. And then you're stuck with something which is really outdated, and then you can't change your legislation. I can't think of one, like, kind of off the top of my head, but so for give you a simple example. So let's say in transportation, right? So if let's say you say, okay, you think that autonomous vehicles are going to communicate with the road like this, and then you put a kind of series of standards on that, and then by the time you write the CAB memo and pass it through Parliament and change all the whatever, 3 years have passed, and then technology has moved, leaps and bounds, right? So
Like share schemes.
exactly, so you get these kind of interesting tensions as well.
I won't try to address.
Rest
assured.
We'll address all these points as we go on in the conversation, but pick a thing
Yeah,
or two.
I think the experimentation point, which you both alluded to, is a good one. And it's important to say that this is, in a sense, this is like everything else being equal logic. If hypothetically we could have all of these 9 things or all of these 3 things perfectly, well, that would be a good thing. Now, we all know that that's never the case, and that's fine. So if we are in a policy area where indeed there is no randomized control trial-based evidence, well, that's okay. All in the sense we're saying is, well, if you had some, then you'd be more confident about the outcome. If you don't have any, well, that's fine. More often than not, there are many of these elements that we can't do anything about. More often than not, say, political commitment isn't something we can actually do anything about. And that's fine, we just have to live with that. All this helps us think about is, what are the things we might be able to do something about in order to improve the odds of succeeding? And I think the best way to think of this is as a very sort of quick, iterative model that in fact supports this idea of experimentation and learning as you go along. So I don't think that anything in this implies the sort of massive 5-year plan type policy planning that supposedly has to go into something to be well designed. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't think that's the case. Pick up on your example of the self-driving cars. I think the legitimacy example is a beautiful one. And this is a beautiful example of exactly this type of tension between what people think of as legitimate and what the evidence would suggest. And arguably, this would lead you down a road of reasoning, which I think is probably the right one, which is to say, well, we could just blaze ahead and say, you guys just don't get it. Here's what the evidence says. This is what we'll put into law. Odds are that this will not work. Odds are that we'll see it firing back. Another example is with AI. There is a very serious risk that if we use artificial intelligence too quickly without first gaining people's trust and making sure people see it as legitimate, we'll get some sort of backlash. And the European GMO type 10-year moratorium of people saying, no more of this nonsense. You're not going to use this technology in government because clearly it's too dangerous and you don't know how to do it. So we'll just stop you from doing it.
I have a bias in this, which is I think the legitimacy sort of portion of your triangle is the sort of the most interesting bit. But let's do due service to the other 2 bits, which, I mean, there is a bias, I think, that's inherent in, Swiss, British, Singaporean policymakers, which is sort of to assume that you've got good policymaking apparatus and you've got good people and sort of like mature institutions. But thinking about our region, Singapore is not the whole of ASEAN, and therefore, I suppose if you were to, I'm speaking to you, but if Aaron and Cheryl want to come in, if you were thinking of countries where the policymaking architecture is less mature, where there isn't so much evidence bases are weaker, where policymaking kind of institutions, you sort of claim that you're neutral on mechanisms somehow. Are you really neutral on mechanisms, or do you actually underneath this have like a kind of template that if you were to go into Nepal or Bhutan or wherever it might be, you'd sort of say, do it like the Swiss do and you'll be fine? So on those 2 other bits, on kind of policy and action, the kind of mechanism, what advice would you have for countries that are not as sort of far up the tree as Singapore, is it?
None, in a sense. So undeniably, like any type of model, mental or otherwise, this bakes in some assumptions about how the world works, but that's very difficult to avoid and in some sense necessary to make anything useful. So I would never claim that this doesn't bake in any type of views. And in fact, what you touched upon earlier, this is an unashamedly government-centric way of thinking about the world. I think you picked up on a very important point. We did run this against 300 case studies from about 70 odd countries. So I would claim that it doesn't presuppose any specific type of policymaking mechanism. Take demonetization in India, for example. Maybe India, in fact, isn't such a great example. Of course, the policymaking mechanism is reasonably similar in many ways to a British one. But reasonable people maybe can disagree about whether demonetization was a success or not. But many people would claim that it wasn't.
Only people who are economically illiterate.
Yeah, many people claim that it wasn't. And if you were part of that crowd, which I think I would be, is that it's hard to not think that no matter what your policy-making mechanism is that makes you arrive at that, it really doesn't matter. But if you had thought more through the policy and crucially more through the action bit, more through the implementation of this, it would have probably achieved its intended outcome rather than doing what it's done now.
I see, but so if you're in a more developing economy, this model works the same way. I mean, I suppose this isn't something that is particularly appropriate for kind of mature policymakers, as it were. So that was my question. So.
I think it breaks down on the if you're a failed state, then at some point this of course becomes utterly irrelevant. And I fully recognise that if you're running Puntland, this may honestly not be the most relevant way to think about the world, and no doubt about that. I think anything above that, I would hold my ground and claim that the logic is the same. And in fact, the governments that we work with range from quote-unquote developing countries all the way up to some of the most highly developed nations on the planet. Now, they might use this in slightly different ways and think of it in slightly different ways, but I think the basic logic is the same. So in a sense, our preposterous claim, if I was to put it that way, is that this is, if you will, sort of the laws of physics of impact, or the DNA of impact, that claim we shouldn't take it too seriously, but that is the underlying logic.
I mean, the only thing I'd say at this stage is I don't disagree that there can be universalizable principles, fairly broad ones that apply to a whole bunch of different governments. The one thing I would say is I think a deep assumption of the whole framework is that it assumes that policy is what I sometimes like to call Athena policy. You know, Athena in the Greek mythologies, right, sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, right? And I think a lot of the assumption is that the policies are going to spring fully formed in all their glory and then stay reasonably unchanging so that they can be evaluated for their objectives and tested and measured, and you look at all the evidence. But policy doesn't work like that in real life. It never springs fully formed, or it hardly ever does, right? It is organic, it's very, very ecological in the sense that it grows and changes and adapts and iterates with time, and I think a lot of the model can still be applied to these various iterations. I just think we should remember that policy is this living and quite breathing thing rather than take the archetype of this very, very immutable kind of policy paradigm.
I mean, I suppose what I was driving at is if you go to India, for instance, you mentioned India, a lot of people talk about institutional capacity as the thing that is problematic, that without good institutional capacity there's not much that you can do, and yet this sort of, I don't know whether within the model you have an answer to the question of, well, how do you improve your institutional capacity if it's not that good for policy and action, because that's the kind of crucial question that comes next, right?
Yes, and so in a sense you're right, this pinpoints where the issue is, but it doesn't tell you how to fix it. Yeah, that's right, and the answers, not to say solutions, but the answers will...
Yeah, I mean, I guess I see the model a little bit more like key success factors. I'm not sure I would go as far as to say DNA. But I mean, if I put my policy maker hat on, and from a practitioner's point of view, it gives you a nice way, a kind of simple way of kind of doing some gap analysis, right? Why am I not getting, the impact that I want, the policy objectives that I want, and kind of looking down this list of essentially what are nine things, I think quite quickly you can find the bit that is probably severely lacking. And then it comes back to this, do you play your strengths or try to balance it out, right? And from the case studies, the suggestion seems to be that you try to balance it out. So, if for whatever reason, you don't have enough evidence, then you go find more evidence, right? Or if your action mechanisms are not kind of well thought through or not well resourced, then that becomes the project I guess you end up working on or focusing on. So I tend to think about it a little bit more.
Let's go on to the legitimacy portion. I mean, so again, when we're not, but sort of to tell us the point that both Aaron and Cheryl raised, which was in a sense about kind of bravery and how brave you should be in trying to change things. Because there's a sense, it's kind of hard to tell whether what you're proposing is radical or cautious, because there's underlying this, there's one sense of which is, don't bring in the smoking ban until people are just about ready for it. Or maybe another way, as we were talking about before, is sort of bring it in quite gradually in little bits to kind of warm people up to it. Don't do it all in one go or it'll kind of collapse in a heap. And that sort of seems fairly sensible to one degree, but it also becomes a recipe for caution, in which if you can't tick all of your boxes, you think, we can't really do this, and so we probably shouldn't do it, it'll all be a failure. So, I mean, just talk us through that, and then I'll go back to Aaron and Cheryl on this particular point about how the framework relates to, so we're having this conversation because the need to reform public services is often, you need dramatic changes, particularly in developing economies, in the way that the state works to cope with rapidly aging populations, highly demanding middle and upper middle class populations that are growing quickly, radical changes in technology. The state needs to change dramatically if it's going to deliver the types of things that people want, and therefore, in some level, that we can all agree on, incrementalism is problematic.
Well, that's what the data tells us, right? So if we look at these 300 case studies, and by the way, we've validated the rubric, so we have a validated rubric with tested intercode reliability together with the Hertie School of Government. So while this isn't sort of physics, it is reasonably valid, I'd say. And so in a sense, then the answer is, well, this is just what the data tells us. It so happens that it seems as if these 9 independent variables do predict your probability of success in some way, shape, or form. Well, success, by the way, is just goal achievement. So does a policy achieve the thing that it was supposed to achieve? That's all we're measuring. We're not passing any kind of judgment on whether it's the right. And so we look at the data, and that's what we see. That gets you to a probabilistic point, which is this just makes a point about probabilities. So all we're saying is that if you were to score full marks on all of these 9 things, the odds of achieving the objectives are much higher compared to if you didn't. Doesn't mean that it's utterly impossible. Also doesn't mean that you cannot possibly succeed if you don't do so well, just the odds are lower. But conceding your point, I think there is a certain status quo bias, or one can see a certain status quo bias in that, because it might make us very cautious. But you can flip that argument on its head and say, well, if we're trying to do something radical, this way of thinking can help you identify the ways by which you can drastically improve the odds of succeeding. So maybe I can't get legitimacy for a particular proposal, but maybe I just have to live with that because it's not possible and I think it's worth the risk. But then maybe there are 1 or 2 other strategic moves we can make, say on action or on policy or whatever it may be, to improve the odds of success. And that makes it a rather useful tool for those who want a public impact revolution, because it helps you be very, very strategic about how we achieve those radical things, or how we improve the odds of succeeding on those radical things.
So give us an example using the framework of, I don't know, whether it's autonomous vehicles or something like that, but how would you try and do that in practice? If you're talking about, if you can't move forward on legitimacy, then move forward on some other front, or?
Yes, exactly. So if, for instance, you couldn't, even though in the self-driving car example, it would feel as if moving forward on legitimacy would in fact be eminently possible and probably the best thing to do. But if you couldn't do that for whichever odd reason, then presumably making sure that as a government we have the ability to manage the way algorithms in self-driving cars are deployed or audited would massively increase our odds of success compared to just doing nothing.
Aaron, Charles, I mean, this sort of raises an interesting issue of political leadership and the role of leadership, because, you know, you could argue, let's take gay marriage as an example. In the West, you might have argued the role of a politician was to stand up and say, this is a good thing and we're going to do it, now come along with us. And then there's other people who'd say, well, let's wait for people to get there or get nearly there and not sort of force people to go along before they're ready. So, I mean, you both sort of alluded to this issue of kind of radicalism and bravery and what this tells you. I mean, what's your sort of reflection of how you should think about that?
My thought actually is quite similar to Danny's, which is that governments have agency, you know, and it's not the case that, you know, there's either an objective yes or no in terms of whether policies are going to succeed or not ex ante. At the start of any kind of policy exploration, we actually most of the time don't know, right? And when governments feel that they have agency will be when they can then say, all right, we'll take some action and try and see what information is out there, see what the system is telling us, respond to it if necessary, if we have strong views. But if we don't have strong views, then take that information that comes in and consider that the learning and the insights that come up. You know, and I do think that government has the ability to influence not just the parameters of the debate, but how actually things evolve in terms of popular understanding. And that may include things like, you know, what people put out on Facebook, what politicians decide to say in terms of speeches or the op-eds that they contribute either to magazines or to newspapers. And there can be contrasting views, but I think that is part of shaping the whole debate. One good example of this actually was when Singapore decided to take on or started to have casinos, right, within larger integrated resorts. In that case, I think the government had a pretty clear idea of what it wanted to do in terms of the economic benefits, but it needed to then gauge what the social reactions would be like. And I suspect if it had been uniformly negative, that would have changed the calculus of the discussion. But what we saw was a society, and even I think a group of politicians who were reasonably divided, right, and who agreed that there were quite significant economic gains at a time, you know, just towards the start of the global financial crisis when the economy needed to reinvent itself. But at the same time, ways in which we could then manage the social consequences and potential downsides of gambling. And that was an example, I think, where the government took a fairly activist view on things and said, on balance, we think this is a good idea, so let's take on board the feedback, let's try and address the social issues, but at the same time try and make sure that we gain the economic benefits from this particular development. Now, we can debate the rightness or wrongness of that decision, but I think that was the process that we went through, and it's an example, actually, of how there is agency and influence when a government chooses to exercise it.
I think just to add on to Aaron's point, I think one area that agency kind of manifests itself is in the ability to define the problem. When we look at this particular model, we are assuming that the problem is somewhat defined, right? That you kind of have this policy area that you kind of want to move through. But actually how the problem is defined really shapes what are your policy actions and what are the possibilities that are available to you. So for example, if I look at aging as a healthcare problem, you know, then I'm looking at healthcare financing, you know, I'm looking at maybe palliative care, chronic care, that kind of thing. If I look at it as an economic problem, you know, then I look at it from the perspective of, you know, second demographic dividend, right? You know, deepening of human capital, retraining, you know, so there are many ways of actually defining a problem. So maybe one way of thinking about it is that policymaker with agency is versatile in redefining and defining and redefining the problem, depending on what it takes to get it onto the policy agenda. You know, and I think that sometimes that helps quite a lot. It's also about thinking about the issue as a body of work or as a campaign. And I think Aaron alluded to this when he said, well, you know, it's not an Athena kind of policy, you know, it doesn't come fully formed. So what does policy making in a day-to-day really look like? You know, it looks like writing about 100 notes of meetings. I mean, honestly, you know, I mean, it's like writing hundreds of notes of meetings, it's writing talking points, it's writing your minister's speech, you know, it's writing the 3 sentences that's going to go into the press release for the policy announcement. You know, that is the actual manifestation of policy making. So when I say I want to do autonomous vehicle policy, what does that really mean? That means everything that touches my desk, I'm going to write the word autonomous vehicle on it in some shape or form. You know what I mean? And I spent 2 years doing that. So it's, I think, again, it comes back to what are the agency and what are the tools, not just as an organizational level, but also as an individual officer, policymaker level.
Danny, so just what I want to do is we'll just to close, talk for a minute about I want you to go do autonomous vehicles, and maybe you can do AI, but sort of talk us through a few examples. But on this question of legitimacy first, if you don't have legitimacy, so you're saying it's useful to have it, if you don't have it, it's a problem. But do you have anything to say on, if you don't have it, how do you get it, if you see what I mean? Sort of, how do you plough the earth so it's more fertile, as it were? So what can you do to build legitimacy? Let's say you have autonomous vehicles or drugs, something where the evidence points clearly in one direction, but the legitimacy is lacking. What do you do about that? I mean, should the government therefore be kind of campaigning to sort of change the weather, or what do you do? What's the advice for that situation?
It's a thorny problem because it's the one. So in a sense, we have the textbook on policy, of course, or many textbooks on how to do quote unquote good policy, and since Michael Barber came along together with a couple of other people, we also have the textbook, if you will, on action or on delivery and implementation. But we really don't have the textbook on legitimacy in many ways, which is why we're spending a lot of time this year trying to figure out the answer to that. I don't have one because we decided instead of doing the usual thing, which is lock a couple of people in a room and try to come up with some really bright ideas, we'd actually go out into the world and listen for once to people and hear what they had to say.
Very dangerous.
Yeah, very dangerous. Because then they say things you don't like.
Yeah.
But, so that's what we're doing, and we're in the middle of that process right now. We're running these sessions across the world, and indeed did one this afternoon at the Innovation Labs World Conference. So unfortunately, I don't have a pre-cooked answer for you, but
at least you're being honest.
Yeah, but if I hazard a guess, I think the political leadership point that you made, Aaron, comes in there very strongly. So clearly there is a role for politicians or other leaders to shape public opinion and shape what people think of as being legitimate.
So before I turn over the questions, maybe Cheryl, so talk us through, if you were, you've done this in autonomous vehicles, it's an example where legitimacy and evidence are in so what would you advise? Do you simply just have to take it gradually and kind of wait for people to come around to the idea, or what do you do to get there more quickly if there's an awful lot of public skepticism about something?
I think about it very much as a campaign, as I mentioned before, and I think it's if you believe strongly that it's something that is worth at least a second look, then I think there is a responsibility as a good staffing officer to keep on presenting that information in different and creative ways, right?
I suppose I meant as government, not simply as a civil servant. But if the government is now convinced that autonomous vehicles are the way to go, does it just sort of wait for the public to come around to it, or does it then have a kind of obligation to start kind of campaigning to change everybody's mind? Yeah,
so I think that there are gaps in different levels, right? So there's a gap between the politicians and civil servants, so sometimes there is an alignment there, and there's sometimes a gap between the government and the society or the public, right? And there is an alignment there. I mean, I think there's certain things that governments can do. So on a very simple level, when we look at the autonomous vehicle, like I said, public perceptions of safety were a big issue. So public trials of autonomous vehicles became quite much more common. And that was deliberate, right? Because it was, it started off with them putting a little buggy around Jurong Lake, So, I mean, we're not talking about big fancy kind of, big bang type trials, but, just kind of slow, socializing in a way, but also not just as a mechanism to convince the public, but also as a mechanism to get feedback, right? Is this something people are comfortable with? What would make them comfortable with it? What are some of their concerns? And I think it's putting that out there and kind of being open to that conversation is actually quite helpful.
Very often when governments are involved in these discussions, it's never a binary, yes, we must adopt everything wholesale about autonomous vehicles, or no, we do nothing at all. There's always some kind of balance, and I think the discussions there are important for the government to realize, what are people really afraid about? Can we do things to address the safety concerns? How do we bring on board the reasonable feedback so that we, in a sense, find our middle ground and find ways to deal with both sides of the extremes in this argument? And I think that is where, and again, right, the policy is actually quite living and breathing and dynamic.
Supriya Sen from McKinsey. I think the panel, great panel, you've discussed quite a bit about changing landscape and technology changes, but I think inevitably a sort of top-down approach and ignoring of the user is happening in policy in general, and it seems to reflect in the framework. You said I don't have to be nice, right?
No.
Okay, so now if you look at...
Be as mean as you like, this is the point.
So if you look at all the three, the legitimacy, it's conventional thinking that you have to have skin in the game of the constituent, of the user, in order for that legitimacy to start coming out, as it were. If you look at, I'll give it a couple of examples. In India, there is the Clean India Swachh Bharat campaign. Look at that as an example. I'm not talking at all about success or failure. I'm just talking about design of the intervention. Now, you need to have build that skin in the game, because there are inevitably winners and losers of reform, and you need to have a greater section of your populace interested in that this going through. And what we have found in impact investing, and I'm quite involved in that space, is you have skin in the game. Second is that, I mean, of course, there are other things like leadership and the embedded culture and so on, which you were talking about. In policy, in the box on policy, I see very little emphasis on leapfrog innovation. And I say this because even if a country has been behind, even if you're Samsung behind Apple, even if you're WeChat behind that WhatsApp, in any space you find that the follower of innovation can be optimistic about results if there is that taken into design, and as Aaron mentioned, in an experimentation format. I don't see anything on that in this particular tool. The third is on the action space. I don't see anything on the user experience and the importance of user experience. The simplicity which is now engendered through digital is giving a lot more evidence on this. So on all these 3 points, I think it needs to be updated.
Just a question actually on the evidence. There's traditional forms of evidence that governments ordinarily use in policy making, and I'm quite interested in the work around AI. So how are you seeing the legitimacy or validity of AI as a form of evidence for policy making? How are you seeing that changing around the world? And maybe, reflecting on the Singapore experience, do you see that changing in Singapore also? Is this now increasingly a valid form of evidence that could be used, and how might you see that changing in the future?
So, I mean, you mentioned, Danny, right at the beginning, Supriya's points about the kind of the epistemic community, the people who want you to focus on empathy or design thinking, but I mean, how do you respond to the fact that by sort of moving above these, you've come up with a top-down framework which ignores all this good stuff?
You basically took away my point about the epistemic communities, which is my answer. And I think design thinking is a good example for this, in fact. So you can run design thinking, or human-centered design, or empathy-driven methods, or whatever you want to call it, through this type of analysis. And what you'd probably find is that it ends up helping with all 3 of the elements, right? If you go through a human-centered design exercise, it might help you with the legitimacy, because by design takes in multiple stakeholders, people who are involved and affected by the policy. In the action bit, it probably helps you iron out some of the kinks that you will certainly encounter on the way, also because we're involving everyone who would be involved in implementing the policy. And on the policy itself, of course, it allows you to test the policy to some extent. So I think of these tools as, if you will, orthogonal to this, which is why it's right and proper that they're not directly reflected in the model, because they run across it. And in a sense, the way we think of this is we can take any method or strategy, such as design or AI or SIBs or payment by results or any other mechanism or policy tool that governments use, and run it through this type of analysis to really understand what exactly it helps us with. On AI, yes, absolutely. So I can't comment, Aaron, you'll be better placed to comment on the Singapore specific question. On AI, absolutely. It's for the first time we have the ability to completely close this loop from quote-unquote policy making through to measurement and back. So in a sense, the distinction between the two and possibly between the three starts to blur in a really, really interesting way, because the iteration cycles that we can run become much, much faster. So from iteration cycles that today...
Can you, I think I'm barely following this, so someone in the audience, can you unpack that a little bit? What is it that AI is going to do that's so radical in policy making?
If I have sensors of any sort that pick up the result of a policy intervention, and it might be traffic, think of traffic sensors that measure how traffic flows in a city. That's maybe the simplest example. But a sensor can be anything. It can be actually a physical sensor, a camera or something that measures humidity or whatever you have, or it can be a human that types in information into a system. That's the most common type of sensor we have today in government. Well, with AI, I can suddenly take in all that information, process it, see patterns that human today would struggle to see, and then iterate the policy based on that. So whereas today the marginal added value of each piece of information at some point goes to zero or becomes negative just because we cannot deal with the sheer mass of information, with AI that doesn't happen. So I can keep adding information as long as I want, and in fact as long as I can still extract useful and actionable information.
You said at the beginning this was an interesting case study for the model, as it were. So the issue with this is that basically people get freaked out by this because it seems too scary.
Yeah, and rightly so. I would say rightly so. The accountability mechanisms that we have today, they're all built around the fact that I can throw a human in jail. Ultimately, that's what it is, right? If I have a caseworker who, for whichever reason, either decides to take a child out of the family for child protection reasons, or decides not to take the child out of the family, what we do is we go back, we ask the person why he or she made the decision, and then we get some sort of narration for what it was. Now, whether that narration is truthful or meaningful in any sense of the world, it almost is irrelevant, but somehow it makes us feel warm and fuzzy, and then we can put them in front of a judge and we can sentence them to some sort of terrible sentence if we feel like it. We can't do the same with algorithms, and we haven't yet figured out who we need to hold accountable and how we do this. And there's some ideas around transparency, but it is far from obvious that transparency is in fact the right way to go, because what if I have an algorithm that is highly intransparent and in fact non-explainable but extremely effective? Should we then use transparency as the mechanism? It's highly unclear. So I think people should rightly be worried about how governments are using this. The potential is enormous, and it would be a shame if we didn't use it, but we have to figure out how to do it.
I mean, I think one of my responses to your question as well is really on the AI comment is also how transactional it makes public policy, and I think there is an element of public policy which is also incentives and kind of behavioral nudges and so on. And I think moving something from essentially what could have been intrinsic motivator to something which is so extrinsic and so transactional almost kind of makes you a prisoner of that intervention. You know what I mean? So I personally, that kind of freaks me out. And I do wonder whether or not that we also lose something. I think there is a case to be made for certain inefficiencies in public policy. I know that's, of course, maybe in public policy school you teach that it should be efficient and transparent, all these things. But there are reasons why it should be inefficient, So in one way, so for example, you're talking about this ever-changing algorithm that adjusts as the behavior adjusts. I think there is a case, for consistency, for example. So, it annoys people that, let's say, if I can't predict road pricing, for example, right, then that's going to be very, very frustrating, right? Because I can't, yes, as a system on a whole, it may be optimized, but my experience is severely not optimized. So things like that, I think.
You mean if AI is telling you what the prices should be, but...
No, if AI determines.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But based on, let's say, it's a very simple kind of sensor model, right? Based on who is in the central business district or whatever it is, and there's absolutely no predictability, and I think part of bureaucracy is also having that consistency and predictability and stability in a system, so I think that those are also policy goals.
I think in Singapore, also dealing with the emergent nature of this technology, so I don't think we are any much further ahead than anyone else. There is the Smart Nation effort, every lamppost is a smart lamppost kind of thing. Quite frightening as a thought, actually. But I don't think we're anywhere near Ultron or Jarvis or that kind of material. I would say three things about AI and why I think it's we're holding back the same way lots of other jurisdictions are holding back. The first is that most AI at the moment is specific rather than general, and that means that the data that you get from the AI is going to be on quite a bounded set of issues rather than anything broad and easily generalizable for broader policy making. So we have to be quite circumspect about what the data is telling us as much as we have to know what it's not telling us. Second thing, most AI generated or algorithm generated data is going to be quantitative. I don't think we've got to a stage where AI is good at looking at qualitative things like tone, emotion, irony, and large amounts of text, for instance. We may get there one day, and I think that's part of the promise of AI, but we're not there yet, and we therefore have to, I think, be very cognizant of the limitations, or at least the drawbacks of some of this material. And then the third, and I guess this builds on the qualitative point I was making, I'm never a fan of any data being self-generated and self-analyzed. I think the human needs to be in the loop. Maybe we need fewer humans in the loop now that we have AI than we needed before, but we still need a human or a few humans in that loop. So this makes me a technology augmentationist rather than a substitutionist, and I'm quite happy to fly that flag. But I don't think that we want AI to replace everything that the human being does.
The AI work that we started to talk about in the end, I think, is some of the most exciting stuff. We have a couple of working papers with us. I don't see any more of those, but if you go to our website, you can download the working paper, which we just published 2 days ago. So hot off the press. I think incredibly exciting and incredibly both dangerous and promising at the same time. And then we're taking the public impact fundamentals to lots of governments around the world, and we tend to learn from these sessions and from these questions as much as anyone else. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you for coming along. Please give our panelists a round of applause.